Okay, great. Perfect, so that's rolling, and I'm just gonna plug in the key. You have the
Okay.
microphone.
Excellent.
If there's any problems, I can watch the live feed. If there's any problems, I'll come in, but
All right.
is this the final? This is good?
Yeah.
Before we,
Looks
I guess,
good.
yeah.
Good as we're gonna make you
Ask the
look.
director here.
Okay,
That sounds really good. Yeah, hang on.
I'm gonna plug in the key. There's gonna be I'll be here when it says recording has the key has been initiated, and then it's gonna say recording has begun.
Uh-huh.
And at that point, it's gonna record everything afterwards.
Okay.
I'm thinking you're gonna feel free to like just edit it where it needs to be,
Yes,
so
we will.
we don't need to do anything official.
No.
But I'm just gonna plug it in. And once you hear that second prompt, you'll be good to go. Whenever you're
Okay.
done, you can just come and get me, or you could just pull out the key yourself, and that's when in the recording will
Is there any
stop.
kind of a light that
Key
we,
has been recognized.
Oh, that's it. Yep.
any kind of a light that we should be watching? If it goes off, it means it's stopped and,
Oh well, this guy will keep going. So this one's fine. It's gonna run on its own. I'll come in and stop this
Okay.
one. That one, it's just you'll hear it in a few seconds. Actually, I think it should say
Sure.
recording has begun. Let me hear it go. It takes a while for the second prompts. When people when people are standing there trying to like wait for it to go, they're like.
Recording has begun.
Okay, so everything after this point is good. Right now we're getting recorded, and when you're
All
done,
right.
just pull out that key.
Okay.
Okay.
thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Susan.
Not a problem.
Okay. Hi, Andy.
Hi.
We're good to go. All
Okay.
right. All right, so I'll just repeat that nobody will see me or hear me, so when I ask you a question, just repeat enough of the context that the question makes sense. And if you forget to do that, I might remind you, but it's okay, we'll edit all that out.
Yeah,
All
great.
right, so if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and your work here at Stevens, your position at Stevens.
Okay. I'm a historian, so, well, let me start that over. So, I should start by telling you a little bit about myself and my work here at Stevens. I'm a historian. I have
You have to say your name.
I'm so sorry.
That's
I
okay.
just saw that you're in the recording. Your head's like a little bit. I have to just lift it up a little bit because
Okay.
your head was just cut off a little.
Oh, that's
I guess it zoomed in, and just in case I want to bring it out, just to.
Okay.
I don't want your head
Yeah.
cut off.
Yeah.
Remember to say your name.
okay.
Okay, sorry.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about yourself and your work here at Stevens.
Okay. My name's Andy Russell. I'm a historian, and I'm an associate professor of history here at Stevens Institute of Technology. I'm trained as a historian. My bachelor's degree is in history from Vassar College. My master's degree is in history from University of Colorado at Boulder. And my PhD is in the history of science and technology from Johns Hopkins University. So here at Stevens, I teach history, I teach American history, and I'm the director of our program in Science and Technology Studies, which is an interdisciplinary degree program where students learn about science and technology and the social aspects of science and technology.
What were some of your early inspirations for writing a book about open standards and the digital age?
So I first encountered standards after I graduated from college. I was looking for a job. I moved to the Boston area, and I didn't know where I was going to work. And I applied for a bunch of jobs at the Harvard Kennedy School, at the Kennedy School of Government. The one I really wanted was in the Shorenstein Center for the Press and Public Policy, and that job was filled. So instead I took a job. I was lucky to be offered a job and took a job in a place called the Harvard Information Infrastructure Project. And that was a think tank that looked at, this was 1997, 1998, and it looked at the internet and emerging issues related to the governance of the internet and business aspects, all sorts of interdisciplinary aspects. And I almost didn't take the job because it sounded really boring. Information infrastructure to me sounded boring, but I took the job because I needed a job. And so when I started at the Information Infrastructure Project, we had a series of seminars. I was responsible for organizing the seminars, and I remember one guy in particular, a guy named Scott Bradner, who works at Harvard. He's got a big white beard, and he came to give a talk about the internet and the internet standards process. And once again, I thought, oh, standards, infrastructure, this is really boring. But it was actually really fascinating. Not only the standards themselves and the process for making them, but then the notion that the standards were at the root of everything about the internet that made the internet so compelling. So that was really the origin of me thinking about standards and wanting to go somewhere to work with standards and think more about the history of standards.
The book, and maybe you want to have the book for the next one?
Sure.
Okay. Your book explores the ride. Your book explores the ride of trade associations that to address various issues that are not being dealt with adequately by industry or government. Is this something that you can still see today? And in your answer, can you also talk about standard-setting organizations and how they facilitate standards development? And how important do you think these standard-setting organizations are to the success of standardization?
Sure. So one of the major themes of my book, Open Standards in the Digital Age, is the central. I got that wrong. Let me start over again. One of the major themes of my book, Open Standards in the Digital Age, is that
Trade
Right.
associations, industry, government. Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the major themes of my book, Open Standards in the Digital Age, has to do with coordinating organizations that lie somewhere on a spectrum between markets and hierarchies. So a lot of people think that free markets organize activities and they do it on their own. Other people contend that governments or centralized authorities control technological progress or social activity or business. And what historians have been arguing more and more in the past decade is that some hybrid types of organizations, neither market nor hierarchy, neither private nor public, are really important sites for controlling technological development and business development. So two examples of those sorts of organizations are trade associations and standard-setting organizations. And there are other examples, engineering societies, and so on. Even universities, to a certain extent, have this public-private character. And so in the book, I look at trade associations and then standard-setting associations that coordinate people who work at the boundaries of public and private organizations. So in the committees that I study or in the trade associations that I study, I often see leaders from business, engineers from universities, engineers from government agencies, all coming together to work on particular problems, whether it's in a particular technology like electrical technologies or computer technologies, or advocating for certain technologies to move ahead instead of others.
Your book details different trends and attitudes, especially in the United States, about the ideology of standards and standards development. Was the relationship of these trends to parallel political and cultural trends throughout the past century something that you expected to find? Do these trends influence one another?
One big question that historians take on when they look at the history of science and technology is the interactions between technology and society. So to what extent does technology shape society? A new technological innovation comes around and changes everything we do? Or should we say that society shapes technology, that societies only create technologies that are valuable to that particular culture? And in fact, it's a false dichotomy that there's a continuous interaction between these things, between science and society, or between technology and culture. And so when I was investigating the history of standards, I expected to find those interactions between American business elites and the technologies they created, or between American professional engineers and the systems that they made. So what was interesting for me was that those correlations existed, and that they changed over time. That from the late 19th century to the early 21st century, at some points we found very close correlations between the societal values that engineers expressed, and then they made things based on that. And sometimes those connections were a little bit looser, and the technologies got to a point where some people worried they were out of control or had kind of momentum of their own or ambitions of their own.
Is there a specific example you can think of that you could cite here?
Yes,
a product or technology? Yeah.
Absolutely. So one example of this dynamic comes from very recent times with the internet, where people worry that our kids, we always talk about our kids being addicted to the internet or being addicted to their cell phones. And so in these situations, people tend to say, well, the cell phone is making me do this, or I can't stop using the internet or checking Twitter or checking Facebook. And so in that situation, the technology seems to have gone out of control and controls our behavior and what we're doing. But on the other hand, some people, some critics, myself included, will look back and say, well, there's two other things we need to keep in mind. One is how users are specifically picking up and using Twitter or Facebook, so you can choose to take it off your phone or choose not to go to the website. And the other is what the designers of those technologies made the technologies to compel users to do. So if it reminds you constantly to check it, then that's going to kind of pull the user in a little bit. So there we can see the values and the ambitions of designers shaping the ways that technologies work, and then user behavior follows accordingly.
Konstantinos loved your book, by the way, and I think this was one particular. He loves this theme about the interplay between how technology influences society and society influences technology. I think that's one of the reasons why he loved your book. This discussion.
Actually, another thought on that is that this also happens at a bigger scale. Where it's not just users and specific personal technologies that they use, but also companies or even countries deciding to push technology in a certain direction or push at a certain time. So to move outside of my book, if we look at, say, military technologies or weapons technologies, there are certain times, world wars, for example, where countries will compete or push the state of the art. I'm thinking of the Manhattan Project, for example. So there's a real case where it's deliberate decisions by policymakers and scientists and engineers to make it a very powerful technology that in turn has effects on societies and pretty dramatic effects. But we can't just say the technology did it on its own. We always need to look at the people controlling and designing that technology.
How has the role that standards play in shaping the digital landscape changed over time? The digital landscape in particular.
So with all technologies, we see an interesting progression of standards and how they fit into that technological change. In the beginning, there's generally no standards. There's a great amount of diversity, and there's really difficult challenges that face anyone who wants to connect parts together, who wants to achieve interoperability. Over time, as the technologies mature and as the social interactions between designers take shape, then we see certain patterns and certain routines and certain standards coming to the fore a little bit. And so this is exactly what happened with computer technology, where there was great diversity in computer technologies, both in hardware and eventually in software in the 1950s and 1960s. And then as we get into the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, we see in certain sectors standards taking place, whether it's hardware standards, and here IBM plays an important role, or software standards with the definition of standard programming languages and networking standards, which is the topic of my book, with internet standards, Ethernet standards, and the ill-fated effort to make open system interconnection standards, to make a really international collaborative standard. And so there's also then sometimes a second phase where once standards are created, then different people will come up and say, well, we want to do something different with this standard, or we want a new generation. And so the old standard then will give way to a new standard. So we see successive waves of standardization. And so depending on what time period you look at, you could see the growth or the gaining of consensus around a standard, or you can see conflict and then consensus falling away from a particular standard, and maybe even the seeds of a new standard coming into being.
Talk a little bit about administrative details in the creation of international standards and how important they are in comparison to technical details.
One thing that I realized when I was researching my book is that administrative details in the making of standards matter just as much, if not more, than the technical details. And this struck me as true because I looked at how many times engineers agreed, or mostly agreed on the outlines of standards, of the technical details, but they couldn't get the organizational pieces right, or the administrative pieces right. So whether it was the process for choosing leaders, or the question of how many votes or what percentage of votes the standard needed to pass and become marked as standard. Sometimes objections were raised, and so these nitty-gritty process details can really derail a standard. And it could be very difficult at times, and still is, for the leaders of standards committees to get those details right. so that the agreement around technology, which is sometimes not that difficult, can proceed forward. And so I think this is why over time we see so much attention in standards committees paid to rules and routines and appeals and almost legalistic concerns around the standards process.
Jenny had, in the questions, Jenny had put this quote from Albert Whitney, and one of the things we can do, if you think it's a good idea, is we can show the quote, we can put a... Yeah, and I'll read it to you here. Standardization is thus the liberator that relegates the problems that have already been solved to their proper place, namely to the field of routine, and leaves the creative faculties free for the problems that are still unsolved. Standardization from this point of view is thus an indispensable ally of the creative genius. The question she has is that this identifies standardization as liberating problems of the past in order to leave room for creativity. If standards are indispensable for creative genius, are they also necessary for innovation? And there are other questions related to standards and innovation, that sort of thing, and maybe kind of riffing off that quote, if you could just talk a little bit about standards and innovation.
Sure.
And how they
One of the major themes in my book is about the relationship between standards and innovation. And we hear a lot about this in the 21st century, but it's interesting to note that engineers for at least 100 years have been thinking about the same thing. And one of my favorite quotes in the book is from Albert Whitney, who's a leader of the standards movement in the 1920s. He was a safety advocate, a mathematician. He did all sorts of things, a fascinating guy. And he believed and wrote that standardization saves the mind and saves human energies because it can reduce things that are already settled to the level of routine, therefore liberating the creative genius. There's a series of long quotes from him that's very elegant. There's a lot of things fascinating about Whitney and about his perspectives on standardization. One is that ideas about the relationship between standards and innovation haven't really changed that much in the last 100 years. This quote might have been given, yesterday. Another thing that's interesting is that it tells us a little bit about the 1920s as well, an era of big business, and you have to kind of put yourself in the mindset of America after World War I, where the economy's booming, but there's some concern about industries that are lagging. So it's an era where mass production is a really important aspect of the American economy, where Fordism is really taking off. But there's some industries that aren't doing so well, that aren't amenable to mass production. Construction, for example, or the fashion industry was something that Whitney and other engineers in the 1920s worried about. And so the context for Whitney talking about standardization and routine and the creative genius is pretty interesting as well. That in their time, like ours, they wanted to unleash the forces of innovation and creativity, but they knew that there were economic problems that innovation and creativity didn't do well at addressing, that there were some fundamentals that they needed to do right and to become more efficient in the way that they produce things. And so these things are connected. We can't think of innovation and creativity just on its own. They have a very close symbiotic relationship. And so Whitney really, what he said stands the test of time. I think people would look at that and say, well, that could have been yesterday that someone said that.
Do you want to maybe stand up? So I'm worried that maybe if you move just,
Yeah.
for the next segment.
Or I
just a
could
little
look, she could stay there and I could just look here.
Well, maybe look above her head just a
Sure,
little bit, because
okay.
I
You
still
can see
feel
me?
like, no, you can't see you.
But
He's just,
I'm
the
down.
camera is looking down.
Right.
And so.
Oh, so you're afraid that so
He's
How is this?
answering, that's
How-
better.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe moving back, or. Yeah,
Yeah, that's where I was looking.
yeah. You're just, looking down
Right.
a little bit,
Right.
and so.
is that okay?
Yeah.
How is that? When
Does that
Andy
look
looks
okay?
at me, does that work?
He's looking
Two,
sideways now.
two sideways?
Yeah,
You could stand right in front of
you
the,
can stand
in
in
front
front
of
of
the
the
Right,
monitor.
right, yeah, but I'm afraid if I do that, I'm
You
gonna
won't, you're
I
not.
haven't seen it yet.
get. No, I'm worried about me.
Yeah, no, but
No, because
the-
if I just stand, I think I'm gonna get.
You're not in
something to
the-
lean- No, something to lean on.
Oh,
Yeah,
yes,
yeah,
okay, yeah, that's
Yeah,
better.
is that good?
That's
and I
better.
can just look,
Yeah, is that
it'll
good?
Yeah,
it'll
just
point next to your head.
up just a little bit,
Is that
yeah,
okay?
yeah.
Is this okay?
Yes,
Just
it's
the
better.
end, just
It
a
is
little
better.
something. Yeah, okay,
Okay.
okay. Thank you, Jen. There's also a quote here from Herbert Hoover. It's about the ability to address and resolve issues that were not being solved by the government or the private sector, or in the private sector. Do you think that the public is more aware of the significant role of standards influence our lives in 2015? Does this matter? The Hoover quote, the public, it mostly assumes that this progress has come from scientific discovery of natural laws, new materials, inventions, and increasing skills. But you and I know that the increase in our living standards and comfort has received an enormous contribution from these related ideas of standards, of simplifications, and specifications. I guess this is mostly about public awareness of the value of standards and the use of technical standards.
One of the most fascinating figures that I came across in my book is Herbert Hoover, who historians have not looked at fondly. Hoover usually gets the blame for not stopping the Great Depression. But if we look at Hoover from a different vantage point, if we think about him as a figure in the history of standardization, we see him playing a very, very critical role. In the 1920s, Hoover was the Secretary of Commerce, and as such responsible for developing in American business the capacity to cooperate. And so he did this quite energetically from his position as Commerce Secretary, advancing what he called an associational vision, where associations of business people would get together and solve problems in a public-private partnership. And so Hoover labored and was quite successful doing this, but hasn't quite gotten the credit that he deserves. And so I think in the 21st century, we can look at Hoover not only as the guy who didn't stop the Depression, but as someone who raised the abilities and raised the awareness of cooperative measures between business and government to do things that people find really valuable and that people ultimately take for granted. And so in 1951, Hoover looked back at the movement for simplification and standardization that he had championed in the 1920s. And in the speech, you can see him saying, hey, look, guys, I was right. I was really onto something, and we need to give a little bit more credit, not just to the inventors, not just to the idea guys, but also the people who really make the economy run underneath the surface.
When he was president, did he support standards efforts?
When Hoover was president, not as much. Yeah, it was more, mostly in the 1920s when you really see him active. Once you get to the late 20s and early 30s.
You know, as a standards professional for, I guess, about 20 years now, I would say that the Obama administration has been more proactive in supporting standards than any other administration I've seen. So I was just curious if Hoover had been, it would have been, it had sort of been dropped if it had been, but yeah.
The relationship between electoral politics and standards can be a tricky relationship. And to think about this relationship really focuses attention not on the leaders, not on the front man, whether it's President Obama or President Hoover, but really in the people that their staff, the people that they rely on for advice, and the people that they rely on to carry out policies. And so with Hoover, to go into his correspondence, you see really interesting relationships, networks of relationships, not only between Hoover and the people he worked with, but then relationships between all of those different people. And so in the 1920s, those relationships created a really powerful network, a public-private network that gave the standards movement real power in the 1920s, and that lasted really throughout the 20th century into the present.
Let's talk a little bit about consensus building. I know there are a number of questions about this and about how important it is for standards development, but also the standards wars and the difference. Does the importance of consensus building fade and then grow over time? And then what's the difference between consensus and how do you get standards wars when you have a system that focuses on consensus? What goes wrong when you have standards wars? Talk a little bit about consensus and standards wars.
So there's a central paradox with standardization. That on the one hand, there's great variety and diversity, and that's irrepressible, it's natural. But on the other hand, standardization, the goal is to shed excess diversity and create consensus around a single solution, with the idea that single solution will create progress going forward. And so throughout the 20th century, we can see consensus building occurring at various places in various times. It's always there. The thing that I've really noticed and that I talk about in my book is that the locations where consensus is can change. So in the early chapters I talk about AT&T and how for AT&T to develop standards it was important to develop consensus within the corporation and then enforce standardization in all of their technologies. Now from the outside that looks like a monolith. It looks like AT&T is just telling everybody what to do. But in fact, if you look underneath the surface and look at AT&T's engineers and business people, they're working really hard to gain consensus within the corporation. Now fast forward to the late 20th century, and we don't have an AT&T, we don't have a single monopoly, at least in American telecommunications or computing. And so the consensus building process takes place more frequently and more visibly outside of the corporation. And this is where organizations like trade associations or standard setting bodies or engineering societies like IEEE or ANSI or the Internet Engineering Task Force really play important roles, is that they facilitate that consensus building.
And how about standards wars?
So one thing that happens let me start over. Okay. Standards are successful when islands of consensus emerge from a sea of diversity and a sea of competition. And we see those moments of stability occur when consensus takes place successfully. But it's always fleeting, and there's always going to be a time when new innovations come up or different ideas come to the fore, and different groups will coalesce around 2 or sometimes 3 different solutions and then compete with one another. And so there's some very famous examples of this. Some people will remember VHS and Betamax. In cell phones, we saw CDMA and GSM. And usually in the public awareness, it comes out as 2 different sets of standards competing against one another. So what's interesting about this is that when standards are in competition, there's already been a consensus building process to get to standards. And so in a standards war, we see yet another phase of either trying to get 2 different technologies to come to consensus, or a winner-takes-all battle where we'll have one alliance on one side, another alliance on another side, and then generally the market decides, consumers decide which solution will become the ultimate standard.
Are standards required for product interoperability, and how has this particular concept changed over time?
Standards are absolutely required for product interoperability. In fact, you could look back at the history of standardization and say that that's the reason why standards came into being, was to get one widget to connect to another. One example that I discuss in my book early on has to do with weapons and weapons manufacturing. And it was a French innovation actually to create interchangeable parts in muskets, because if a part would fail on the battlefield, it was handy to have another replacement in there that the soldiers knew would fit on the gun. So there's a special urgency there. Maybe we don't feel that urgency as much when our phone breaks, or maybe we do. In any case, yes, standards are absolutely required for product interoperability.
Has this particular concept changed over time, this need for interoperability? Is it different now?
In some technologies, we see one company providing the entire technology, and so they take care of interoperability concerns within the company. And so I'm thinking, for example, of the IBM System 360, which I discuss in my book, where IBM made all the different components of System 360, whether it was printers or memory or displays or those sorts of things. Later on in the computer industry, say with the personal computer, we see different manufacturers making different components, and standards becoming very important for being sites of interoperability between different components. And we see that today with, if you imagine your laptop or even your phone with standard ports for power, for audio, for memory components and that sort of thing.
Can technical standards be viewed as a way to control a technology? How does this relate to how companies treat technical standards, both internally and when attempting to cooperate with their competitors? This is also related to a question about movies that have been made in the past few decades that explore the idea of unrestrained technological power, and you mentioned some of the movies in your answer.
Sure. One of the things that I focus on in my book is the way that standards can be used to control technologies or to control or shape the trajectory of technological change. What's interesting to note is some companies over time pick up on this and devote tremendous amounts of resources to developing the capacity to get into standards committees and to shape technologies in a way that benefits their company. And so one example that I discuss in my book is IBM in the late 70s and early 1980s. When they went into networking standards for computer networks, they developed a vast hierarchy, a very sophisticated hierarchy of engineers who could go and visit different standards committees, not only in the United States, but in Europe and global standards committees, to nudge and shape technologies in a way that would benefit IBM without disrupting the consensus building process altogether. And IBM's convenient to single out, a lot of people have done that. One of the other things that I uncovered in my book is that a lot of different companies were doing that. And so over time it became more and more common to see companies have a director of standards and to train engineers in how to operate in standards committees and how to contribute to the consensus building process while always keeping the company's strategic ambitions in mind.
A number of interesting movies have been made in the past few decades that explore the idea of unrestrained tech. It's on page 157 if you like to.
Yep.
Couldn't remember.
No. Yeah, I remember. I was trying to figure out a way to work that in. The relationship between standards and technological change in the matter of control, sometimes, to understand that, we need to look down really in the details of correspondence between engineers from the same company, talking about how do we operate in this standards committee, how do we do that. And so that can be pretty subtle. In other cases, it's pretty obvious that how do technologies operate in a way that can control or achieve objectives, broad societal objectives. And so two movies I just mentioned in my book are Desk Set, this kind of nice movie with Audrey Hepburn and Spencer Tracy, where the question is, does a computer have a mind of its own? This is a theme foreshadowed in many different science fiction films. 2001 is another good example, and the example that my students often know is Terminator. And when they think about surveillance and the internet, they often talk about Skynet.